In this session, I'd like to talk about a model. Then I'd like to talk about a better way to talk about a model. And then I'll spend some time sort of explaining how I went about it. So this video may be a little long, and so I'll apologize to begin with. This particular model is looking at a number of possible alternatives given a situation where there's a difference between the desired performance and the actual performance, which represents a performance gap. This model is actually from a paper by Nelson Repenning and John Sterman, and there's a link here to that paper, and it's well worth reading. So I have a friend in Sydney, Jeff McDonald, who seems to be very fond of saying, everyone's models are ugly except your own. We develop a model and we become very invested in the model as we develop it, and we sort of develop a sense of understanding about this model that we are developing, and we're not consciously aware of the extent to which we're developing that understanding as we go through the process. So we develop this wiring diagram, and then we which for us contains an enormous amount of meaning, and then we send it to other people, and we expect them to have the same wow moment that we had when we finally arrived at the insight that the model presents, though they weren't on the journey with us, and we don't give them enough notes or a map to follow to understand where we've come from and where we've arrived at. So they look at the diagram and say, oh, this is confusing, and they just sort of shrug it off and don't pay much attention to it. So even if the model is really meaningful, you often have real difficulty conveying that meaning to other people simply because you end up being your own worst enemy because of the way that you go about it. One should think of a model as a story, which is why the loops are labeled. And typically it's said that you sequence the balancing and reinforcing loops separately, which I think is actually wrong. I think you should sequence all of the loops with a single sequence so that it gives the reader a sense of what order to attempt to understand the model, so that this model goes from a B1 to a B2 to an R3 to a B4, as opposed to this being an R1 reinvestment loop. So what we have here is a set of alternatives based upon, given that there's a performance gap between actual and desired performance. And the P1 work harder loop says, well, one of the options is that the performance gap creates a pressure to do work, which then promotes more time spent working, which improves the actual performance, which reduces the performance gap. And since there's a single subtracts from or opposite influence in this loop, it's a balancing loop. Whenever there is an odd number of subtracts from or opposite influences in the loop, it's a balancing loop. If there are an even number, it's a reinforcing loop. Another alternative is that this performance gap influences pressure to improve the capability of the organization, which influences time spent on improvement, which is actually represented by an investment in capability, which after some period of time improves the capability, which improves the actual performance, which then reduces the performance gap. So if we follow this loop, we have a work smarter, which is still a balancing loop because there's one subtracts from influence in it. Now, the reinvestment loop. Now, this is where it begins to get complicated trying to understand what actually comprises the loop. And here's where an aspect of Kumu that really shines, because these loops are defined, as I described in the previous lecture, so that you select a particular connection, and then you select additional connections, and once you define a set of them, you assign a label to it. And once you do that, you notice that if I mouse over this particular label, it tells me which are the pieces that are actually part of that loop. That also is true for the work smart loop, so that there's no confusion about which portions of this model are actually part of that particular loop. So when it comes to the reinvestment loop, this is a loop that sort of reinforces whichever approach the organization has focused on, so that if the organization is actually focused on using the performance gap and pressure to do work, it reduces the time spent on improvement and therefore less time investment in capability, and after some period of time the capability erodes and the performance erodes, so that there's more pressure to do work, and it's a vicious reinforcing loop. Whereas if the organization is focused on improving capability, then there's less pressure to do work, which is more time spent on improving, more investment in capability. The capability increases and the actual performance improves. So it's a virtuous reinforcing loop. It's a reinforcing loop because there are two subtracts from or opposite influences in the loop, so it's even, and therefore it's a reinforcing loop. The last loop, the B4 shortcuts loop, is what happens when there's a pressure to do work. It removes or subtracts from the time spent on improvement, and therefore there's more time spent working, but the capability erodes over time. So what happens is, to actually keep up the performance, the organization ends up resorting to doing shortcuts, which is sort of a short-term fix, because after a while, as capability erodes to a point, you can't take enough shortcuts without actually having a very negative impact on the quality of the product. So this is one way to walk through this in terms of simply mousing over this. But the question is, where is all of this explanation that I did in terms of what the loops actually mean? If you look over here, there's a link right here. It says B1 work harder. If I click on this link, notice it takes me to the loop. Notice this is actually a profile page for this loop, where there is a description, which is what I just talked about a moment ago, and then there's a link to the next loop with a description, a link to R3, the reinvestment loop, with a description of that, and then a link to B4, the shortcuts loop. So that now notice, as it goes to the shortcuts loop, that particular loop is emphasized as opposed to the rest of it, so that one can actually tell which aspect of the loop is being talked about. Now the way that this was, now when I click in the background, I get back to the profile page for the map itself. Several things were done here. I put the perspective for this on a new perspective, as opposed to using the one that was done before, because I already had enough stuff to find in it to be confusing. And as I said, if you use Alt-S, it will show you what the perspective is that's defined for this particular map. If I go to perspective, here is the definition, and the definition was created with the decorate elements and decorate connections wizards. But if you want a new perspective, whatever perspective you're currently on, you say switch perspectives, you come to here, you can create a new perspective, which then makes that the perspective for this particular map that you're working on. So notice that I have several different maps that have been defined over the last few lectures, and all of the rest of them are based upon this default perspective. But process improvement, this map is defined upon a new perspective called process improvement. And that particular perspective, if you look at it, is just what you saw a moment ago when I did the Alt-S command to show this to you. And so the definitions that I do within the process improvement perspective don't have any impact on all of the other maps that I've defined within this Kumu environment project. The other new things that are introduced here are this down reference. This is a link to the paper by Repenning and Sturman, which you can read. The default is that it opens external links in a new tab. If I click here and tell it I want to edit this, you can see that this is left bracket, right bracket, and then the link is actually in parens. If you go to the Markdown definition page, you'll notice that it's the second thing defined in basics is this is how you do an inline link to somewhere else. And as I said, the default is that it opens in a new page. If I had just dropped this URL in the field itself, notice that it just would have showed up as a selectable URL. So it's very easy to put external references into the description that's on a profile page. Just drop in the URL, and if you want to make it nicer, go ahead and put it put a label in front of it in brackets, and then put the URL in parens. The other part here is done with what's called internal links, and in the next section of this course I'll talk in depth about internal and external links, because there are just marvelous things that you can do with them. So that this is a left bracket, right bracket, which is the link portion, and then it says pound process improvement, which is the name of the map itself, and then it says B1 work harder focus equals 0. It says this right here, which is the label for the loop, and then it says focus equals 0. And what you end up with is the same thing that would happen if you clicked here and simply focused on this. Oh, let me go back here and cancel this. If I simply clicked on this and focused, notice that it says pound process improvement B1 focus equals 0, so that one doesn't have to scratch their head and figure out what the internal link is, because it defines it when you click within the map itself to get there using the focus or using the clicking on it and holding it, so that I said that this showed up here, and I just copied this and put it in the link on this page. And then when I clicked here, I typed in the definition of this, and I put in equals pound and the name of the next loop that I wanted to go to, so that it does work smarter and adds that one to the definition. This is just R3 investment and the name of the next loop. This internal reference is called a slug. Now, I'm not sure why they decided to call it a slug, but in the next section I'll talk in depth about how to find and use slugs, because they're just very convenient for referencing aspects of a model, whether it's a causal loop diagram or some other type of model, to unfold the model to your audience in a manner that makes it easy for them to understand the insights that you have developed from laboring over this model as you have worked on it, for hours or days, weeks, or sometimes even months, to figure out what the meaningful relationships are. So a bit of insight into a model and how it was developed using a new perspective, different from the perspective for the other maps that are part of this project, and unfolding that model using internal references so it steps through from one segment to the next in an orderly fashion to make it easier for someone to understand. So I hope you found this meaningful, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.